July 7th, 1944. The night over the Tanapag Plain on the island of Saipan hung heavy with tropical heat and the smell of cordite. In the darkness, the quiet was deceptive, too still, too measured, as if the island itself were holding its breath. In a shallow foxhole near the front, Marine Artillery observer Corporal James Whelan adjusted the focus on his binoculars, his hands slick with sweat and rain. Through the gloom, faint shapes were moving. Not scattered patrols, not the random silhouettes of stragglers, but an entire army, forming in the open. Whelan had seen enough battles to know the difference between chaos and coordination, and what he saw now made his stomach drop. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, bayonets fixed, were assembling shoulder to shoulder in the half-light. Some were limping, some carried stretchers, others were wrapped in bloody bandages. Behind them, officers raised gleaming swords that caught the flicker of distant fires. They were preparing for something ancient, something suicidal, the largest Banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. Whelan keyed his radio, his voice a calm tremor of urgency. Grid 164-223, estimated 4,000 approaching. This is no probe. Fire for effect across Saipan, the US Marine and Army Artillery network, 23 miles of howitzers, long toms and naval guns, came to life as if a giant had drawn a breath. What the Japanese could not see was that they were walking into a machine designed for mathematical slaughter. Beneath the palm-lined ridges of Saipan, the American fire control system was unlike anything the world had seen. It could link dozens of batteries through wire and radio, calculate firing angles for every gun on the island, and bring shells from sea and shore crashing down on one square of Earth with the precision of a stopwatch. Time-on-target missions meant that every shell, no matter where it was fired from, would arrive in the same instant. It was the industrial age turned into artillery music, a symphony of destruction written by engineers and played by men in steel helmets. For the Imperial Japanese Army, courage was everything. Their doctrine of Gyokusai, to die like a shattered jewel, had turned death into duty. In China, these human waves had broken lesser armies, but in the Pacific they met an enemy that fought with slide rules, meteorological data, and logistics chains stretching across oceans. The Americans had learned at Guadalcanal, refined at Tarawa, and perfected by Saipan how to turn mathematics into annihilation. By the summer of 1944, the situation for Japan on Saipan was hopeless. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito's 30,000-man garrison had been compressed into a pocket at the island's north end, barely 3 miles across. Supplies were gone, ammunition was measured in handfuls. The wounded lay stacked in caves that reeked of smoke and antiseptic. Yet Saito's final order, found later on his body, declared, "There is only death. In death there is life. We will advance to strike one last blow at the American devils." That sentence sealed the fate of every man under his command. As dusk gave way to blackness, US intelligence picked up fragments of radio chatter, hints of a final attack. Forward observers noticed eerie silence from Japanese guns that had pounded them for weeks. The absence of shelling meant only one thing: they were saving everything for a last eruption. Marine officers across the line ordered their men to double ammunition, check fuses, and tighten the perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, later recalled, "We all felt it in our bones." This night would be different. At 4:45 a.m., faint ripples of sound drifted over the plain. Murmurs, chants, then shouts rising like surf against rock. "Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!" The cry multiplied into thousands of voices. In the dim light, a solid wave of humanity emerged from the mist, bayonets flashing like silver fish under a storm. They came in ranks, the wounded among them, civilians with bamboo spears behind the soldiers. It was a scene from another century crashing headlong into the machinery of the modern one. Whelan's voice cut through the radio net again. Grid 164-223, enemy and open, regiment strength, immediate suppression. The reply was instant. Roger, time on target, all batteries, splash in 90 seconds. In the fire direction centres miles behind the line, officers and sergeants bent over plotting boards, calculating trajectories by lamplight. Distances, elevation, powder temperature, barrel wear, all variables converted into data, all data into destruction. At 4:47 the first shells screamed overhead, then came dozens more and then hundreds. The entire valley vanished in white flashes as the sky opened like a thunder god's drum. The Japanese charge staggered, faltered, but still came on. Men ran through sheets of shrapnel, some on fire, some carrying their wounded comrades on their backs. The Americans adjusted fire, dropping the barrage 50 yards at a time, sweeping it forward and back in a rhythm called ladder fire, a scythe of steel cutting through the dark. By 5:30 a.m., the ground itself seemed to heave with the concussion. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay motionless. Others crawled forward through the bodies of their comrades, still screaming their emperor's name. The observers called for another shift. Drop 200, left 100, repeat. Shells walked through the ranks again. It was industrial death made clinical, precise, relentless. As daylight broke, survivors of the charge, fewer than 1,000, stumbled into the American defensive lines. The 105th Infantry Regiment took the brunt. 2 of its battalions, fighting from sandbag positions and shattered bunkers, were nearly obliterated. Marines and soldiers fought hand-to-hand among burning guns. Artillery crews pulled the firing locks from their howitzers and joined the line with pistols and carbines. When Japanese soldiers overran one Marine battery, the gunners depressed their 105mm barrels and fired point-blank, using ricochet shots to turn the open field into a killing ground. Offshore, the battleship USS Tennessee and cruiser USS Louisville joined the storm. Their massive naval guns hurled 14-inch and 8-inch shells into the valleys, lighting the horizon like dawn. Coordinated through shore-fire control parties, the ships fired blind through smoke, guided only by the calm voices of spotters surrounded by chaos. By sunrise, the plain had become a vision from hell, palm trees torn to splinters, bodies lying in grotesque rows, smoke drifting low across the earth. Yet still, here and there, small groups of Japanese soldiers rose from the carnage and charged again, rifles raised, screaming. It was courage without reason, faith without chance. The Americans held firm, mortars thudded, machine guns rattled, and the last echoes of Banzai were drowned beneath the roar of the modern world. When the sun finally rose above the wreckage of Saipan, it revealed a battlefield unlike anything the Pacific War had seen before. The green canopy that had once covered the Tanapag Plain was gone, stripped bare by shell fire. Every tree was splintered, every blade of grass scorched, and scattered across that ruined landscape lay the shattered remnants of an army that had ceased to exist. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had taken part in the charge. By mid-morning, more than 90% were dead. For the Americans who survived the night, victory felt hollow. Major Edward McCarthy, whose battalion had held the central sector, described it in his after-action report. It looked like a cattle stampede that had frozen mid-charge. Only the bodies kept moving after they fell. Around him, Marines and soldiers stood in silence. They had fought through every kind of battle the Pacific could offer, jungles, ridges, coral reefs, but nothing compared to this, the destruction of an entire army in a single morning. The numbers defied imagination. 12,000 artillery rounds fired in 15 hours, 2 battleships and 8 cruisers contributing over 600 heavy shells, mortars, machine guns and rifles expending more ammunition than most campaigns consumed in weeks. And against that storm of fire, the Japanese had advanced with rifles, swords and desperation. It was courage colliding with physics, and physics had won. In the shattered lines of the 105th Infantry Regiment, acts of heroism shone like sparks in a storm. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, already wounded, refused to retreat. When his position was overrun, he climbed onto a jeep-mounted 50 caliber machine gun and fired until his ammunition was gone. Then he fought on with 2 pistols until he fell. They found his body surrounded by 30 enemy dead. Nearby, Private Thomas Baker, too badly wounded to walk, had ordered his comrades to leave him behind. "Get the hell away from me," he told them, propping himself against a tree with his pistol. When they returned later, he was still there, dead, the pistol empty, 8 Japanese soldiers lying around him. And in a field hospital converted from a bombed-out tent, Captain Benjamin Salomon, a dentist turned battalion surgeon, had transformed his medical post into a fortress. When Japanese troops rushed the aid station, Salomon killed 4 with his rifle before manning a machine gun to cover the wounded. They found him later slumped over the weapon, riddled with bullets and bayonet wounds, 98 enemy soldiers lying before him. He would not receive his Medal of Honor until 2002, 58 years after he died saving men who could not save him. By noon, the valley was silent except for the crackle of fires and the moans of the dying. Graves registration teams moved slowly through the smoke, tagging bodies, counting, marking. They recorded 4,311 enemy dead. American losses were grim but not catastrophic, roughly 1,000 killed and wounded, most from the 105th. The math was brutal. For every American casualty, more than 4 Japanese had died. General Holland Smith, commander of the Marine Forces, visited the site that afternoon. He walked among the bodies and said nothing for several minutes. Later he would write, "They attacked with incredible bravery, but bravery cannot defeat fire control." The battle had proven something deeper than victory. It demonstrated that warfare itself had changed forever. For centuries, courage had been a currency of war, honor, discipline, willpower. But on Saipan, courage had met a calculus it could not conquer. The Americans had turned artillery into a science. They had built systems so precise that emotion no longer mattered. The Fire Direction Center, known simply as the FDC, was the unseen brain of this new war. Inside, a handful of men with slide rules, maps and telephones could unleash more destruction in minutes than entire divisions once managed in days. They calculated range and deflection using graphical tables that corrected for wind, air temperature, powder heat, even the rotation of the Earth. Radios like the SCR-300 and SCR-610 carried those calculations across the island, their FM signals cutting clean through static. Every battery, from light 105mm howitzers to the long 155mm long toms, was wired into the same grid. A forward observer like Whelan could call in a target, and within 90 seconds rounds would already be in flight. The Japanese had nothing remotely comparable. Their artillery, based on World War I French doctrine, relied on runners, flags, and guesswork. They could take 15 minutes to respond to a target the Americans could hit in 90 seconds. Communication was courage-dependent. When messengers died, the system died with them. On Saipan, this difference became absolute. The Americans could coordinate 150 guns, dozens of mortars, and naval batteries in perfect synchrony. The Japanese charged blind into a storm they could neither see nor understand. They fought as their ancestors had fought, with valor, with ceremony, with faith in spiritual victory. The Americans fought with equations. That morning the old world of war died. The sword met the slide rule, and the slide rule won. Yet even among victory, unease lingered. Lieutenant Colonel Justice Chambers wrote later, "We killed thousands of brave men who never had a chance. It wasn't fear we felt. It was something worse. It was realizing that courage no longer mattered. The surviving Japanese who escaped the field vanished into caves in the cliffs of northern Saipan. Some fought on for days, a few refused to surrender for years. Among them was Captain Sakai Oba, who would lead a guerrilla band until December 1945, months after Japan itself had surrendered. They called him the Last Samurai. 3 days after the failed charge, General Saito performed seppuku. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had already taken his life the night before the attack. Their suicides ended Japan's organized resistance on the island. The consequences reached far beyond Saipan. When word of the disaster reached Tokyo, an entire garrison annihilated, its leaders dead, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed within days. Japanese commanders had promised the emperor that Saipan was impregnable. Its loss brought American bombers within range of Tokyo itself. By November, B-29s were taking off from the island's new airfields, beginning the firebombing of Japan's cities. Admiral Asami Nagano, chief of the Imperial Navy General Staff, would later admit, "Our war was lost with the fall of Saipan." But the lessons of the Banzai charge did not end there. The Americans studied every second of it, every call, every barrage, every mistake. Saipan became a case study in the application of industrial firepower. The techniques refined there, time-on-target missions, ladder fire, overlapping defensive grids, would shape modern artillery doctrine for decades. In Korea, when Chinese forces launched human wave attacks in the winter of 1951, US artillery responded using the exact methods born on Saipan. At Chipyeong-ni, a single American division destroyed an entire Chinese corps using coordinated fires. By the time of Vietnam, the process had evolved further. Computers replacing slide rules, helicopters serving as forward observers, By the Gulf War of 1991, GPS-guided shells could strike a target within meters, but the philosophy was the same: calculate, coordinate, annihilate. For the men who had witnessed Saipan, that efficiency was both triumph and trauma. They had survived, but at a cost measured not in blood alone, but in the quiet knowledge that war had become mechanical, that the future of battle would belong not to the bravest but to the best organized. By the time the smoke cleared from the Tanapag Plain, Saipan was no longer just an island, it was a graveyard for an idea. The Japanese army had fought not merely a battle, but a philosophy, the belief that sheer willpower and sacrifice could overcome machines and mathematics. That belief had shattered before the precision of American fire control. What had once been the heartbeat of the samurai spirit was now buried beneath splintered palms and craters. In the weeks that followed, American engineers turned the battlefield into airfields. Bulldozers rolled over the same ground where thousands had died, carving runways that would soon launch the B-29 superfortresses bound for Tokyo. The irony was brutal. The site of Japan's last great charge became the launching ground for the weapons that would burn its cities. Every explosion that would later light the skies over Tokyo began here, on ground soaked with the blood of men who had believed courage could defy industry. Historians would later call Saipan a turning point, not just for the Pacific War but for warfare itself. The Banzai charge on July 7, 1944, was the last of its kind, a final doomed collision between human faith and technological reality. Never again would a modern army launch a mass infantry assault, believing that honour alone could prevail. The lesson was too terrible to forget. Among the Americans, that morning remained etched in memory. Some spoke of it as a necessary act, others as a nightmare that never left them. Private Arthur Robinson of the 105th Infantry, interviewed decades later, said quietly, "They kept coming, wave after wave. We didn't want to kill them all, but they left us no choice. It was horrible, and it was the future." For him, the horror was not the violence, it was the ease. The machine worked too well. In Washington, military theorists dissected Saipan like scientists studying an experiment. They saw proof that the American model, industrialized, coordinated, data-driven warfare, was unstoppable. The Fire Direction Center became a permanent fixture of US doctrine. Every modern army on Earth would eventually adopt some version of it. The concept that had guided the guns on Saipan would echo through every war that followed. For Japan, the lesson was more personal and far more painful. The samurai code that had guided its soldiers for generations had been turned against them. Officers had convinced themselves that moral superiority could overcome material inferiority, that faith in the emperor could defy artillery, tanks, and planes. The Saipan Banzai charge revealed that faith is fatal illusion. Yet even then, the imperial army refused to abandon it. In the months after Saipan, similar charges erupted at Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, and Okinawa, each ending in slaughter, each repeating the same tragic script. The ideology of the beautiful death consumed tens of thousands before the war's end. A few Japanese officers did learn. At Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi rejected Banzai tactics entirely. He built fortresses underground, fought from defense, and made the Americans pay for every yard. He had studied Saipan and understood that courage alone was worthless against fire control and air superiority. But Kuribayashi was an exception. The system that had demanded suicide over surrender could not reform itself in time to matter. When the atomic bombs fell a year later, many of Japan's surviving officers finally understood the true scale of the transformation. What began on Saipan as the mechanization of artillery had ended with the mechanization of annihilation. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final expression of what Saipan had foretold, that war had become an industrial process, its outcome determined not by valor but by science. Even victory had its ghosts. American veterans who had stood on the Tanapag Plain carried that morning with them for the rest of their lives. The efficiency of it, the precision, the way death came on schedule, it haunted them. Lieutenant Colonel Chambers wrote in his private papers, "We didn't fight men that day. We fought belief itself, and we killed it with mathematics." The moral wound of Saipan lingered long after the guns fell silent. In the years that followed, as America entered new wars in Korea and Vietnam, the shadow of that efficiency followed its armies. Time-on-target barrages, overlapping artillery grids, computerized fire control, all of it traced back to those hours in July 1944. The principles were perfect, but the questions they raised were not. Could humanity survive a kind of war that no longer needed heroes? At the 50th anniversary of the battle in 1994, a small group of aging veterans returned to Saipan. The airfields were quiet now, reclaimed by palms and coral dust. Standing near the ridge where Whelan had once called his first fire mission, one Marine looked across the valley and whispered, "It's peaceful now, but I can still hear them." A Japanese delegation was present that day too, descendants of men who had died in the charge. They placed flowers at a monument inscribed with a simple line, "To those who believed courage alone could change destiny." One American veteran approached, saluted and said softly, "You were brave men." The world just changed too fast. Modern warfare was born on that ground. Not in strategy rooms or laboratories, but in the chaos where human will met industrial calculation. The guns that broke the Banzai charge were not merely tools of destruction, they were instruments of a new order. From then on, wars would be won by logistics, data and control, not by spirit or sacrifice. Saipan became the threshold between eras, the last stand of romantic war and the dawn of mechanized annihilation. The charge that began with shouts of Banzai ended with silence so total it seemed to erase the sound of courage itself. The statistics remain cold and exact. 4,311 Japanese dead, around 1,000 American casualties, 12,000 shells fired, 600 naval rounds, 3 artillery shells for every enemy life taken. Numbers so precise they feel detached from humanity, and that was the essence of the change. The war had become arithmetic. The side that could calculate faster, communicate clearer, and coordinate better would always win. In that sense, Saipan was not only a battle, it was a prophecy. It foretold the future of every conflict to come, from Korea to Vietnam, from the Persian Gulf to the data-driven wars of the 21st century. A future where machines speak faster than men, where precision replaces valor, and where courage, though still honored, is no longer decisive. The soldiers of Saipan did not know they were writing the first chapter of modern warfare. They fought as their fathers had fought, unaware they were already part of history's last stand of the human charge. Their bravery deserves remembrance, but their fate stands as warning. In the valley where they fell, the grass has grown back, the sea wind carries only silence, and the craters are filled with rain. But the ghosts remain, not as shadows of men, but as echoes of an era that ended that morning in July. The Banzai charge of Saipan was not just the death of an army, it was the death of illusion, the final moment when the sword met the machine and learned what the future of war would be.